Welcome to the Youth Expo series event on space. My name is Shani Chowdhury, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. Sitting beside me is Dr. Scott Hayes, a professor of the practice of international affairs in the Elliott School of International Affairs and the director of GLB's very own Space Policy Institute. You can also catch him teaching me and 16 other students about all things regarding U.S. space policy and history on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings in room 212 at Elliott. So it is my great honor to be introducing Dr. Hayes tonight. Before joining as faculty for the school, Dr. Hayes served as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. He's also had numerous experiences working for NASA, the White House Knowledge Policy, and the Office of Space Commerce in the U.S. Department of Commerce. Tonight, the two of us will discuss whether the U.S. and China are truly in the space race, the significance of private space corporations, the militarization of space by both nations, and the possibility of cooperation in future space expeditions. We ask that you please save any questions you have towards the end of the event, as there will be a 15-minute question and answer period. And to start us off now, Dr. Case will now give his general thoughts about where the U.S. and China currently stand in terms of competition and cooperation in space exploration and policy.
Okay, thank you. And it's on. Are we recording okay? Sound level okay? Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. So talking about U.S. and China in space, we start talking about space policy, and what it is really composing about three parts. There's a civil part, scientific part, dealing with what things like NASA does, planetary exploration. Things like weather satellites, so we're all familiar with. There's a national security part that deals with satellites in space providing information to combat forces on the ground. We can talk in more detail about what that consists of. And then, of course, the commercial part, which is things like communication satellites or the GPS receivers that are embedded inside your cell phones that we take for granted every day. And so in looking at space policy, it's not something that's just done by one agency. It's not just a NASA thing. It's not just a DoD thing. It's something that countries as a whole do. The space race, as probably many of you are familiar about, the first space race began in the 1960s with the launch of Sputnik, which was about 65 years ago today. So none of you were alive when Sputnik happened, I don't think. And that was a fairly traumatic event for the U.S. because the U.S. Basically had assumed that the Soviet Union wasn't that technically advanced. And so for it to launch the first satellite, passing overhead, going deep, kind of freaked out about everyone in Washington. There was lots of op-ed pieces and concerns in Congress and so forth about what does this mean. In the context of the Cold War, although the satellite itself wasn't really that militarily significant, it was very, very symbolic. Because the United States and the Soviet Union were confronting each other across a very, very broad front. A lot of countries that had been colonial possessions had become independent. This number of members of the United Nations had grown dramatically. And so part of the competition for hearts and minds of these new independent countries was also rooted in symbolism. That is, are you going to follow more of a capitalist Western path? Are you going to follow more of the path of the Soviet Union, communist or socialist path with a strong central government? And in the 1960s, you could make an argument that both of them had pros and cons associated with them. So the Sputnik launch was not just simply a military symbol or a symbol of the Cold War, but also part of a larger political struggle happening around the world, particularly focused on newly independent and developing countries. That race had its course, and although it ended with the landing of Apollo 11, in 1969. And that particular form of the space race came to an end. So today, when we talk about space activity going on, it's a very, very different world than in that first space race. I'll often use the terms, space is much more globalized, much more democratized than it was then. Globalized meaning, of course, there's many more countries involved. It starts with the two superpowers. Now virtually every country in the world has something involved with space, larger or smaller. But there's lots and lots of countries that are involved now. One of the largest UN committees is the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space, over 100 members. Now, they're not all there because they want Star Trek. They're there because they often have very practical uses for space. water, environmental monitoring, technical developments, growing your own industry. So really pragmatic things. Everybody kind of likes to hear the astronauts come and talk, but the reason why they're there every day is maybe for more practical purposes. Now, when this environment is also very democratized, meaning there are many more non-government entities involved. So, of course, you have those visible things like, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos and space tourists going up. But you also have companies like Planet, which is a fairly small company building very even smaller satellites that are providing a lot of the high precision commercial imagery in Ukraine. So what the Ukrainians are using for intelligence in many cases is commercial U.S. imagery. Now, also the GPS I mentioned inside your cell phone, inside your cars, that comes from a military signal. That signal is provided by military satellites, run and operated by the U.S. Space Force. But globally, the number of military users is actually relatively tiny. Very, very important, very, very critical, but certainly nothing compared to the hundreds of millions of users of GPS in the civilian world. So manufacturers of GPS are really a commercially driven company, although the satellites themselves. So you have these sort of hybrid mixtures of both government and private sector going on. The question for discussion this evening, of course, is what the role of China is. China launched its very first satellite in 1970. It broadcast the anthem, some may know, the East is Red. So instead of the beep, 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 at least the Chinese one had music. And in the case of this 1970 was also notable because it was the first year that Japan launched its first satellite in the same time. Now, China had a much slower development period. It didn't have that kind of hyper racing period that we and the Soviets had in the early days. So it was only just after the turn of the century that they launched their first human into space. The Chinese focus has been very much on practical developments, but now it's moving into larger scientific and symbolic developments. So they not only have humans in space, they're building their own space station, roughly about 60 metric tons, similar to the size of the old Russian Mir space station that deorbited in the 90s. They're also doing things that hadn't been done before. So they've landed a rover on the far side of the moon. They've sent spacecraft to Mars, which is really hard. And they have essentially a full spectrum space industry. So if you look across all the things that one does in space, well, the Chinese have kind of one of everything, if not two of everything out there. Charlie Bolden, who was a former NASA administrator, went to China during the Obama administration, and he met with the head of the Chinese space agencies at the time, which is run under the People's Liberation Army. And the opening didn't start off that great. The guy started off with looking at Charlie and saying, "Let me be clear. We don't need you." Second response is, "And you don't need us." And then the third is, "But we could do great things together." Well, that's true too. And so often it's asked, well, why not? How come we don't do things together? I'm an ex-physics major, so pardon me if I use a physics analogy. There's a thing, maybe if you've ever taken a chem course, you know what activation energy? You got to get a certain amount of energy to get over a hump. I got a barrier here. I need a certain amount of energy to get over that barrier, to get to the other side. And so political issues, political differences are kind of like that energy barrier. And if you want to get to the other side, there has to be something there you want. Why would I bother, getting to the other side of this barrier unless there's something good over there? When we began cooperation with the former Soviet Union, we did one test project during the Soviet period. But when we began cooperation with the Russians in earnest during the space station program, this was in the early 90s during the Clinton administration. And two things had happened. The energy barrier had gone down. The Soviet Union had fallen. The relationship was less hostile. Soviet forces had withdrawn from Eastern Europe. There was no possibility of a successful Soviet invasion of Western Europe anymore. So a major source of tension went away. And the Russians had experience in long duration spaceflight. They had experience with large rockets. They had things that we wanted. So the combination of the political barriers dropping down of energy we had and something we wanted was there. In the case of China, they have things that we want, but nothing that's really that compelling. If political barriers and that their energy barrier wasn't there, Would we find ways to work together? Sure. The way we work together with Europe and Canada and Japan and other countries. But the combination of nothing that's really that compelling combined with this energy barrier, politics, makes it a problem. And you say, well, do we have this competition really in space? I say actually not. If you look at the kind of areas where we have a number of tensions with China, and there are many, they're not quite that severe in space. So I go to the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, involved in bilateral discussion. We've had space security dialogue, all that sort of thing. Our institute has a kind of affiliated relationship with the Beijing Institute of Technology. They have a space law program over there. We've been getting scholars here. Of course, we follow what their official statements and so forth are. China has not yet made the kind of statements that leave no room for compromise. If you look at statements made about other areas, South China Sea, Taiwan, Tibet, Uyghurs, cyberspace, and so forth, not a lot of hope there. It's pretty cut and dried. Whereas in the space area, hasn't really. There have been people in China who've said, fairly, how should we say, aggressive sorts of things. But that's never really been in the official statements. So I'm of the view that there are some things we could do with China, but not really at the really politically visible level. China lands on the moon and gets moon rocks. Well, we have moon rocks too. We'd like to maybe trade for some. There is a scientific exchange. They're getting biomedical data for a space station. We'd like some of that biomedical data, and we'll trade for some of ours. When they go to the moon or go to Mars, we want to exchange information about where the spacecraft are, so they don't run into each other. It turns out there's been dozens of spacecraft launched in and around the moon. We know where most of them are. Notice most, not all. So better space situational awareness about what's out there. If we're both going to have astronauts out there, we have international treaties on agreements on the rescue and return of astronauts. Well, we'd like to have interoperable systems. We'd like to understand what frequencies people are talking on. So this doesn't mean that we're going to have a common project together. I think politics don't justify it. But there are areas where we can engage in bilateral communication and in part encourage forms of engagement that are really kind of denied to us in many other areas where China has taken very hard and fast positions that don't really leave really a lot of room. Space is not yet one of them. So I'm not one who thinks we're in a race with China. They're certainly a competitor, economic competitor, military competition, diplomatic competition, all that. But space doesn't yet have to be that kind of zero-sum game, although it might be, but it's not there yet. And so with that, let me pause and ask the questions.
All right. Can you guys hear me? Good. Good. Okay, I think it's good. All right. So basically, yeah, as Dr. Pace said, there's been a lot of discussion about how, U.S. China has been in space and been in a space race or not. And so what I wanted to ask you, Dr. Pace, was basically, why do experts and policymakers keep attributing this relationship between the U.S. and China in space as a space race when, you have talked about how there's really not that much competition currently happening right now?
Well, there is kind of a competition. Obviously, they're doing things on the moon and going on sort of Mars, but it's not like it was during the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War, environment, what we were doing in space was very symbolic to the entire rest of the relationship. Space doesn't really quite carry that symbolism. So if you look at the motivation, say, why China is doing things, the motivations are actually fairly straightforward. They're doing things because it increases the prestige of the Communist Party. They do it because people look on it favorably, so that they pay attention to domestic opinion, and people take pride in those activities. They do it because by building high-quality spacecraft and systems, that you're driving up the quality of the supply chain. So if you're a company supplier and you're building, say, a Shenzhou spacecraft, that thing better work. And there's a sort of quality level. It attracts students and younger people into STEM education. Sounds familiar. So a lot of the reasons why China does things, again, would sound remarkably familiar to us. It's not as if there's some, larger, again, Cold War kind of a competition, at least as far as space is symbolized. There's competition in lots of other areas, but space isn't really quite that. And I think people fall back on the space race idea because it's kind of easy to understand because it seems familiar to us. We had a race with Russia, now we're racing with the Chinese, and the fact that can kind of misleading. That doesn't mean we're actually going to be friends and cooperate tomorrow, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're in this zero-sum race. What you do see happening is a situation where there are probably competing blocks that are forming. Now, I would argue, so everybody's familiar, like the space station, we have the U.S., Europe, Japan, and Canada as our major partners. We want to expand that to others, say South Korea, Brazil, South Africa. But in the case of one of the interesting wild cards in this is going to be India. India, of course, has a non-aligned status for many, many years. They're not really interested in cooperating with China for all kinds of political reasons. And yet their partnership that they've had with Russia is also going downhill. Russia is kind of the failing state at many levels, not just militarily, but their space industry is really in bad shape. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that I could go into. But they are simply not the space power that they once were, and it's arguable that they can keep things up. So if there's a partnership with China, China is definitely going to be the senior partner, sort of in that. So what does India do in that situation? They don't really want to give up their non-aligned status. Russia is not really an alternative. China is not really terribly attractive. So they start looking, I think, at Quad. So the combination of Japan, Australia, United States, as well as India. So just as they're participating in the Quad in the areas of the Indo-Pacific, I think they're also sort of participating kind of in space. But that's the kind of reshaping of the relationship going on. It's not this kind of Cold War situation. We now have many more countries involved. Russia is sort of fading, China is rising. There's a new coalition sort of coming together. Are they inevitable? Are they destined to sort of conflict? Maybe, maybe not. But there's different groupings coming up around them, and the competition is not really going to be. It's not really just a technical. It's also kind of almost a social and cultural. What do I mean by that? We don't really just send our machines into space. We don't even send just people into space. We send our values into space. So the idea of a private sector, the idea of human rights, the rule of law, all this kind of stuff that we think is kind of rare in the Enlightenment, all that, and we share that with other countries that we call like-minded countries. Now, that doesn't mean China's not going to be in space. China absolutely will be in space. In fact, under international law, we call space the province of all mankind, which means China has the right to be in space. On the other hand, I don't want China to be in space without me. So I want me and my friends to also be out there to represent themselves and represent their values, in that environment. And so the competition in space is not a race necessarily toward a specific objective or a singular symbolic contest. It's really one of, here's this critical domain that everybody depends on, militarily, economically, scientifically. And the question is, what are the rules and order of that? So just as we worry about what is the international order on Earth, what is the international order in space look like? What are the values of that order? How are disputes resolved? Who represents and participates in shaping that order? That's what the larger competition, I think, is about, as opposed to a singular race.
And speaking about how there's now more, competitors or participants now in the space race, or really just space cooperation or space exploration in general, in recent years there have been multiple collaborations between private space corporation and U.S. federal agencies. like with SpaceX and NASA regarding space exploration. So what is the future of those federal and private space partnerships in the US? And is there any potential for those specific corporations to actually work with foreign governments in China instead of just, having NASA with the China National Space Administration?
It's tough, but yeah, there is. For example, there's a company called NanoRacks, which flies commercial payload. So if you have a payload you want to fly on the space station, you go to them and say, "Here's my payload. You get me on board," and they will go and package it, to make sure it passes safety inspections and fly it. When Vietnam flew its very first small CubeSat, they went to NanoRacks, and NanoRacks took it. So here we have a Vietnamese-built satellite flying on a U.S. commercial vehicle to the International Space Station that then went into the Japanese module and was ejected into space from the Japanese module. So all these pieces, kind of came together. There also was a Chinese scientist who did a commercial deal with NanoRacks and flew his experiment aboard the space station. So it didn't represent a direct cooperation between the Chinese government and the U.S. government, but we had a Chinese payload package that flew as a commercial deal, and it went through Congress, and people looked at it and said, "We have any objections?" Straight commercial deal. There was no technology transfer, whatever involved. The information was scientific data that was openly published, and simply not an issue. So there are areas I think where China has been developing its own industries, and so you find Chinese versions of SpaceX, or at least they hope to be, or Chinese remote sensing companies, and Chinese sort of services going on. The kind of uncertainty right now is with the kind of economic turmoil that's been brought on by the zero COVID policy and frankly by Xi Jinping's own economic policies. A lot of high-tech businesses in areas in China have really hit. And so I think that those policies have not only harmed a lot of Chinese tech sectors, but they've also harmed sort of the space sector as well. So if that continues, maybe it won't grow as rapidly as maybe we had thought a few years ago.
All right, great. Yeah, and so basically, yeah, as you just mentioned, so China also has their own private space corporations as well, and they've also collaborated with their own federal space agency, but there hasn't been as much compared to the US. So then do federal space agencies like NASA collaborating with private space corporations in the US gives the US an advantage in space compared to Chinese space agencies and their collaboration with private space corporations in China?
I don't really know yet. The major sort of change that's been happening, we've gone from governments doing everything and determining everything to shifting to buying more space as a service. So some of you might be familiar with software as a service. An example of it is probably Microsoft 365. You don't really own it, but you kind of rent it, and it's kind of a service for you. And you hope they maintain it and keep it up. Today, we buy commercial services for carrying cargo and crew to the station. And we have safety certifications and launch reviews and all that. But it's not a government thing. It's like government. The launch we had today, SpaceX Crew 5. So we had 3 rookie astronauts, 1 Russian on her first SpaceX ride, and 1 American rookie. And the most experienced and Native American woman, first astronaut ride. And the most experienced astronaut was actually a Japanese guy on the commercial launch. It was kind of fun. But the government is looking to get out of doing things that can be done by the private sector. If you go to a military base, you shouldn't see soldiers mowing grass. Okay? That's a waste of their time. So shifting things more towards civilian services and reserving government doing things that only they can do. We're at a point now where launching crew to the space station is something the private sector can do. The government shouldn't do that. On the other hand, there are things that make no economic sense whatsoever for the private sector to do. That's where the frontier is. Landing the first lunar landing, not really a commercial thing yet. It might become one in the future, but it's not there now. So you can imagine essentially an outgoing economic frontier, something starts being fully government, transitions to contracting with the private sector, private sector start performing it as a service. The government moves farther out and doing those things. If something makes sense from a commercial revenue standpoint, from the U.S. standpoint, the government shouldn't be doing that. Now, other countries have different views. So other countries like space agencies that engage in revenue production. But we generally try not to. We try to say government shouldn't be in business. And where that frontier goes will change. So in the future, you may see commercial services like communications and navigation in and around the moon, commercial power in and around the moon, commercial transportation back and forth between them. So getting that point, that frontier is sort of an ever-changing one, depending on technology and markets. I think China might try to adopt something similar, but because they operate in a very different economic system, there's a question of what is the market discipline going to be there. If a company gets into trouble, are they just going to get bailed out? I often try to ask about, tell me how cost estimates are done in China. And, and I get this look like pat on the head. Oh, you poor naive person. We need more money. We make more money. Things happen much more in a command economy sort of way. So that's great in the short term, but in the long term, it creates things like real estate bubbles, overinvestment, and other distortions that can be really bad for the economy in the long term. Is that happening in the space area? Well, I don't know. It's too soon to tell.
Right. Yeah. And in addition to private space corporations utilizing space, there's also the militarization of space as well. And so I also wanted to ask you as to, how have U.S. and Chinese space agencies utilized space to uphold their own nation's security and military defenses, especially off land?
Especially
off land. So like in space in general.
Well, like I say, the U.S. made a decision very much after Sputnik, creating NASA as an open civilian agency, because part of the propaganda campaign to sway other people to say, here we're an open system, come see us. We blew up our launch vehicle on national TV, very embarrassing. But when it worked, it was also very credible because people could see it. So we created a NASA as having a separate civilian open agency. Were there military things that were going on that we didn't talk about? Absolutely. There's a dark world going on as well. But we had this intentional kind of white world open system. China doesn't do that. They don't separate it that way. The China National Space Agency sort of looks like a civilian agency, but the real economic, intellectual, financial power is with the PLA, because that's the organizational structure that has the technology and skills about armaments, directorate, and obviously ties ICBM capabilities and so forth. So there's not this separate program distinction. China has pursued, again, pretty commonsensical kinds of things. They have their own satellite navigation system. So Beidou is, if you will, an analog to GPS. They have their own communication satellites. They have remote sensing and reconnaissance systems. Of course, they have launch vehicles. The question becomes is what might they do next? They launched a anti-satellite weapon in 2007. They were roundly criticized for it. We criticized them as well. We had launched our own destructive anti-satellite weapon as late as 1985. And we created a lot of debris, and we said, this is really a bad idea. Let's not keep doing this. So we stopped. A lot of the criticism, this is kind of maybe a subtle point, that we levied at China over the 2007 anti-satellite test, we created all this debris, which is still actually a hazard today at the space station. It is not that they did an anti-satellite test, again, because we had done the same thing, but because they did it in a really dirty way. And we knew Chinese science engineers that we had been talking with knew how to do a cleaner test. But either the PLA didn't listen to them, or they just went away, or they didn't talk. They didn't say really what they were doing, all of which is kind of disturbing. But they did an experimental test that they created a lot of debris, and so that's really what we criticized for, because we actually knew they knew better. And of course, the Russians did something similar in November of 2021, possibly just send a message somehow that no one received prior to the Ukrainian invasion. We prepared their satellites, so don't oppose us elsewhere. They created a lot of debris, not quite as bad as the Chinese debris, but still pretty destructive. And India has done its own test, which again we criticized India for. Probably the least degree, probably of all the bunch. But some of it went into higher orbits that I don't think even India kind of expected. So what we're trying to do now is to get people to like quit creating trash. Like, okay, everybody knows you know how to do this, but let's not create more trash. And because the more objects that are up there, the more chance of hitting them, and the more chance of damaging them. So a lot of discussion today you'll hear about sustainability, which is largely a code word for don't create debris, and if you have debris, try to bring it down. How long should satellites last? We're having these populations with thousands of satellites in them. How do we manage that and bring it down? So I'm a little hopeful on that, because really all spacefaring countries have an interest in long-term sustainability, even if they've made mistakes in the past. So I think part of the discussion with the military is to say, sure, you want to use space for military purposes, but you actually don't want to damage it in such a way that you can't use it for those purposes. You have a self-interest, in some restraint. But anyway, that's what we're arguing about.
Great. Yeah. And so since we were speaking on anti-satellite missile technology in general, now that the US is now trying to actually deter anti-satellite weaponry in space, what kind of movement will we see then from nations like China and India, who are just starting out in terms of using anti-satellite weaponry and testing them? And they just don't want to risk national security. They want to find something else. They want to keep using, these weaponry to uphold their national security.
I think that, I kind of hope they would maybe take a lesson from our own experience, which is these things really aren't terribly useful. You can go in and destroy a satellite, that's for sure. But you create a lot of debris in the course of doing it. You've only destroyed maybe one satellite. It doesn't really take out all the capabilities. So it's a very, very costly and dirty kind of technique that doesn't really provide a lot of military benefit. Ideally, one could come to agreements to limit the use or even deployment of anti-satellite weapons. We're starting off with the U.S. position. Other countries were trying to align with us to not do testing of destructive ASAT weapons. It doesn't mean space weapons won't exist. It doesn't mean that there won't be military uses of space. But it does mean that doing tests that create a lot of debris and damage the whole environment is not really terribly helpful. In other domains, if you sink a ship, it sinks. If you shoot a plane down, it falls. In space, it sticks around for a couple thousand years. So, it's a very, very different kind of problem. The other thing that I think one wants to be careful about doing conflicts directly in space is they probably don't tend to stay in space. If suppose a Russian attack or a Chinese attack aboard a U.S. missile warning system or GPS system or something like that would happen, the likely U.S. response is not that, oh, you blew up one of our satellites, we'll blow up one of your satellites. That's kind of a dumb response, because now we're just creating more debris and we're more dependent on space than they are, so blowing up their satellite health vendors. We'd like to do something in another domain. So that could be cyber attack, it could be economic attacks, it could be naval or air action. So you quickly spread from being something in space to being something happening in other domains. So it's kind of horizontal escalation as well as vertical escalation that goes on. Nobody has a lot of experience with that, fortunately. But because nobody has a lot of experience with that, it's very, very uncertain which way it goes. I've sometimes seen speculations, say in a Taiwan Strait crisis that China would attack GPS satellites and reconnaissance satellites to keep U.S. forces out of Taiwan Straits. We would probably not look at that as a purely regional thing, because GPS services all these areas, our satellite service the globe. We would see that probably as a larger attack quite beyond the region. So even if the Chinese intention was, oh, we're just worried about this area, you should keep out, we would say, you're doing something that actually is really escalatory and is harming people not in the region. And we are probably going to take a more stronger response to that. It's not going to be limited to that. Given how reliant many infrastructures are, financial networks, transportation networks are on things like GPS, an attack on that would probably not be seen as a purely narrow military action. It would be seen as something that would harm millions of Americans. And any president really wouldn't have an option but to respond, very, very strongly. So space is kind of dangerous because something that looks like it's just a narrow thing quickly can become a much bigger thing. So people should probably be careful and tread lightly.
Yeah, and as part of like that, maintaining that treading of, keeping national security at bay, especially for the U.S. and Chinese governments. In 2011, there was a U.S. policy passed by Congress known as the Wolf Amendment that does ban NASA from using government funds to not directly collaborate with Chinese government or Chinese-owned companies without the approval of Congress or even the FBI. And so because of that, how is it possible to still witness potential collaboration on lunar exploration programs, like with the NASA Artemis program and the CNSA Chang'e projects? Or, will these restrictions still need to be kept at bay as we go on in the future in terms of maintaining space policy and diplomacy?
So the Wolf Amendment is very famous, and many times people think it means, we can't have bilateral cooperation with China, particularly NASA can't have bilateral. That's kind of not true. Now, the Wolf Amendment, I think, is a very visible and symbolic kind of statement. But the reality is, if we found something that we wanted to do, we could. Now, some of them are fairly modest projects. I think my favorite is Himalayan Watershed, where both we talk about water, feeding the Ganges River and rivers across Southeast Asia. And that commercial project I mentioned that was flown, that was something that was commercially approved. So you basically, the Wolf Amendment arose out of a conflict during the Obama administration, where Mr. Wolf, who was head of the Appropriation Committee that covered NASA, had very strong concerns about human rights in China, particularly religious minorities and Christian persecution and so forth. And so he had a view that we shouldn't cooperate with China on a very moral ground. Mike Griffin, my boss at the time, was going to China, and Mr. Wolf wasn't happy about that, so he calls us in. What are you going to do? And Mike says, well, this is what I'm going to see and where I'm going to go, and I'm not going to do anything, unusual. And Mr. Wolf was like, okay, fine, great, I trust you. Back. That was like 2007, 2008. Then in the Obama administration, the science advisor, Dr. John Holdren, came in before the same committee and was asked about cooperation with China. And Dr. Holdren's response was, basically, that's none of your business, we'll figure it out. You don't really tell head of appropriation committee that it's none of their business. And Mr. Wolf's concern was, again, not just a moral issue and human rights issue, but he was concerned that there really wasn't a plan. So he didn't trust the White House not to have a plan. And it got off to a bad start with a very strong assertion of executive privilege and authority on the part of Holdren. And the next thing that happened was the budget for OSCP office in the White House that Dr. Holdren had got cut about 50%. So below, the Congress is letting it know who's in charge. So the Wolf Amendment was put into place, one, as a moral statement, but two, as a statement of saying, if you're going to cooperate with China, you need to explain what it is you're doing. And we don't think you have a plan. Until you have a plan, you're not going to do that. So this is the tug of war between the White House and sort of Congress. as has happened, again, in more recent years, I've seen things go through and get approved. So the Wolf Amendment, again, is a very symbolic activity, but it's a very permeable. You can walk through that gate if you've got a good story. But as I said in the beginning about the energy barriers and getting to the other side, there's got to be someplace you want, and the barrier has to be low enough. And there really certainly hasn't been that many. I think what we're seeing is with Russia, its cooperation has gone down, and there are potential for cooperation with China going up, but again, at a fairly modest level. These kind of reciprocal, transparent exchanges, things of mutual interest, like we need to coordinate if we're both going to be on the moon, make sure we don't run into each other. We could exchange scientific data. So it's not going to be a large common mission. And they're not going to be members of Artemis and all that. But that doesn't mean there can't be areas of cooperation exchange. And that's I think what we're still exploring.
Thank you. And so, yeah, that's basically all the questions that we have for the moderated discussion portion of the event. We will now move into the question and answer period. So, yeah, I can switch mic.
And absolutely. And before we officially enter our audience Q&A session, we would like to ask if you have a question, please raise your hand, and our lovely staff, Rob, who's taking a picture here, he will hand you a microphone. For those who are joining us virtually, feel free to ask questions in the chat. We will try to cover as many as possible during our Q&A session. Please.
Hi. So recently, NASA made headlines by crashing the DART probe into an asteroid as part of an Earth Defense Initiative. How far does that overlap with anti-satellite testing? Would there been exchange of transfer of technology there? And then how does that impact on the U.S. China relationship?
So the question is, what technology, what overlap is there in the basic technology, and how much transfer occurred?
Is that likely to is that likely to scare China or others?
First, it's not likely to scare them because they have the same capability. You know, a exquisite astrodynamic capability to, you know, if they can go to Mars and do a soft landing, they can certainly, you know, go get an asteroid if they want to. So I don't think it raises, you know, any really sort of serious military questions because it's really mostly interesting science. That being said, there have been proposals for decades and decades to ban by Russia and later China together to ban placement of weapons in space. And so, what is the difference between a space-based weapon and what DART was? You know, it's really just intention. And so we've largely rejected, we in the U.S. have largely rejected these proposals from China and Russia as being fundamentally meaningless because you can't define what is a space weapon. You can define a destructive action. You can define things like a performance-based thing, like don't destroy this object and create a lot of debris. Okay, everybody can kind of see that. But to have a space object and say, is this a weapon or is it a scientific instrument? Well, it depends on how it's used. This technology is kind of like the same. One of my favorite aspects of the Russian proposal on banning space weapons is they had a section on exemptions. And one of the exemptions they carved out for were instruments necessary for cosmonauts survival. And that meant that there was in the Soyuz craft, there is a combination flare gun and shotgun in the survival kit because they landed in remote places in the wilderness where there are wolves. And, you know, you kind of need a survival rifle and a flare gun. So that was explicitly exempted in the proposal. Nice of them. So the problem with defining the blurred nature of dual use technology is such that you really can't tell the difference because under some of those proposals, you can argue that the DART mission was illegal because it was a space weapon. Not something we would agree with, and something we think is terribly. So generally, we've seen in more recent years is a focus on performance based. So banning tests of constructive descent, direct descent ASATs. Everybody can probably verify that. So therefore, because you can verify it, that means it's potentially meaningful as an arms control agreement. An arms control agreement that cannot be verified. It may represent a nice sentiment, but it's not enforceable. It's not action.
Does anybody else have any questions?
My question was sort of related. Second, sir. Your answer just now. Thank you. That's great. And what do you think the future prospects of space lawmaking is with U.S. and China, and with the situational awareness capability in space, they increase, can verify more, and they can define clearer between like blurry technology terms. What do you think the prospect is?
A couple of things. There are a number of sort of major space treaties, but we really haven't had new ones really probably since the mid 70s. There was kind of a great majority of space treaty making early on out. A lot of reasons for that, and I don't really see prospects for major new space treaties. What we are seeing is people agreeing on what might be best practices, or guidelines, or voluntary kind of measures that go through the UN, get multilateral understanding, adopted by General Assembly, but then enforcement or implementation happens at a national level. So, for example, if you go to the Federal Communications Commission down here in the Southwest and you get a license for a communication satellite, then there will be a provision for how you're supposed to dispose of it at the end. Well, the disposition requirements look remarkably like the UN voluntary guidelines on mitigating orbital debris, but that's done at a national level. So we don't recognize transnational authorities, don't recognize authorities outside of the sovereign state, but we do use multilateral systems to come up with common understanding that we then enforce, at a national level. The same kind of development is happening on the question of space resources. So myself and colleagues have been in these, international discussions about what to do about space resources, like asteroids and new materials. We actually have more common agreement with China, sometimes than we do with some of our European friends, particularly Germany, who often would want to have a new treaty or a new transnational organization. And both the Chinese representative and the American representative typically go, nope, sovereign authority, nope, we're not delegating to anybody else. Nation state, retains some sovereignty. We find ourselves often in agreement against others who want to create these transnational structures. And the Chinese view is very practical. They want to use the resources, natural resources themselves. They want to leave that option open to them. They want to do it in a safe and responsible way. Same as us. So that's an area where actually we're kind of in agreement. The area where we should be in agreement that we haven't figured out how to implement it yet is space situational awareness on debris. We would love to see data coming from China, radar, whether optical, whatever, and share that about what are you guys seeing of it. They accuse Starlink, for example, of threatening or coming near their station. Well, we looked at the data and like, oh, nothing there. So either you're lying or you don't really know what you're looking at. Either one of which is disturbing. We'd love to get more of an exchange about why do you believe that and what was your evidence? Why did you think that? We haven't gotten that kind of close exchange. We create warnings. The 18th Space Control Squadron creates warnings when satellites are coming too close to each other. And that includes Chinese satellites. We don't want anybody to get because that's just bad. All of us. When we send those warnings out, we send them to the Chinese Foreign Ministry and they disappear. And they go into this email address. We don't know what happens to it. We try to ask where to go. Give us maybe an email of a satellite operator. We can talk to them directly because that's what we do with commercial companies. We talk to them directly. We don't get direct email addresses. So we'd love to find a way, I think, of having more direct communication like that, and to have more of a discussion about Why do you believe something is a threat when you not believe it's a threat? This is what I mean. I don't think it's destined to have conflict with China in space. I think we have some common interests, but we don't really haven't quite figured out how to operationalize that yet. That's simply exchanging each other's trusted email addresses. That would be a great start.
Hi, Professor. So looking over the U.S. spaceward development so far, despite the status, how much of a possibility do you see of U.S. and China, their fight over space while turning to a hostile hot war, let's say, over territory?
So I don't see space war is simply war. It's not something that is separable to me. We don't talk about naval war, ocean war different than air war. It's all just war. And so there is usually going to be some political context for it. We don't have like Martian and lunar colonies that we're fighting over. All our vital interests are all still on Earth. So if there is a conflict in space, it's likely because of course something here on the ground. The bulk of what Space Force is about is providing services. You know, kind of like this is an old analogy. Now they're cell phones, but in the old days when people had wired telephones, there's the dial tone. You knew you could pick up the phone. There'd be that dial tone on the other end that's working. A lot of space services the military depends on missile warning, navigation, communication, sensing, all that. This is kind of like the dial tone. So if you're a commander at Indo-PACOM and you're worried about Chinese forces in the area, you depend on space as kind of like this dial tone delivery port. And so because of that dependency, we know that China and Russia also want to hold those assets at risk. But it's not because they want to conquer space or because they're trying to conquer the lunar colonies or something. They're trying to affect what's happening on the ground or on the oceans. So making space a more resilient environment, one that can deal with potential threats or operate through potential threats, to me is intrinsically stabilizing. Because if we think that we're going to lose space or lose a critical advantage, then that starts becoming an incentive to escalate and expand the war into other regimes. And what you'd like to do is to keep space kind of like calm and quiet, separate, such that it doesn't trigger other escalations. But it's not because we're fighting about space; we're usually fighting about something on the ground.
And we will take one last question before we close our event.
Hello, Professor Pace. I'm Nora. I was wondering, as you discuss space is becoming more privatized, and as we saw with SpaceX launching a Tesla into orbit, how do we regulate the proliferation of debris from the private sector? And then, as stuff in orbit today makes so many movements to avoid that debris, how do we ensure it's safe for the private sector? Who's in charge of cleaning up the debris that's there?
Sure. So something you might Google, take a look at. There's actually a Japanese-based company with a bunch of U.S. friends of mine heading it here called Astroscale, and they title themselves space sweepers. Their job is cleaning up, and so they think there's business there. The short answer is that you are careful about what you license to go up, kind of in the first place. And so as the number of satellites going up has increased, you're starting to see more and more requirements for them to have end-of-life disposal. The Federal Communications Commission, which licenses commercial satellites, not government satellites, has put like a 5-year limit when you're supposed to deorbit or dispose of your satellite. If you're below 2,000 kilometers, if you're above that, you're out in geosynchronous orbit or farther deep space, it's thousands of years. But if you're closer into the Earth, under 2,000 kilometers, you need to deorbit in about 5 years to kind of get rid of. So you want to avoid creating new debris. So you want to be fairly clean in how you deploy. You want to avoid creating debris, like don't blow things up. You want to deorbit systems. And then there is a small category, relatively small, of objects, mostly in polar, here's the Earth, here's the polar orbit. And there is a category of arguably 100 and 200 Russian, Chinese, and U.S. Dead derelict debris, rolling around. And they had no control, they're dead. Some of them are fairly large, some of the Russians are fairly large. Those things are probably the most risky and hazardous objects. If they hit each other, they have no control, they create more debris, that would be bad. So one of the priorities is how do we go out and remove those objects? We know they're dangerous, we know they're there, we'd like to just kind of get rid of them. The problem is there is no such thing as salvage law in space. There's no such thing as an abandoned ship. Every object up there still belongs to the original state, either launching state or original owning state. So if we go up and grab a Russian stage, for example, and clean it up, we are infringing upon their sovereign rights. Now, do I think the Russians are going to clean up after themselves? Probably not. So part of the debate we're struggling with now is, can we create an agreement about items that we voluntarily listed as salvageable? I have a list of objects that are registered with the UN. Every one of those objects must be registered. Can I get to a point where somebody could say, hey, I don't own this anymore, and if anybody wants to grab it, have at it. I accept the liability. So defining what might be the market for removing objects is something the companies are still struggling with, and dialogue between them and the regulators as to what to do. That's a cutting edge.
All right. Thank you so much. And one round of applause, please. And before we officially close our tonight's event, I'd like to first of all thank our wonderful moderator, the Chinese Treasury, as well as Professor Scott, for taking the time to speak with us tonight, as well as everyone that's here and everyone from the USCSSO and Onero, worked very hard to make tonight's event possible. We would also like to give out a special thanks to the Security Asian Center, as well as the Delta Phi Epsilon Foreign Service Fraternity for promoting our event. If you are interested in attending any of these events in the future, please be sure to follow our Instagram and Facebook accounts, where you will find those details as well as numerous research projects by our members from both organizations. And just one last final round of applause. Thank you.